Hi again. John Wesley Bready, page 143 of this Freedom Whence. The chapter is Preaching Social Righteousness. John Wesley is taking on the slave trade. He goes on, John Wesley Bready goes on, the slave ship captains and plantation owners came under a condemnation quite as castigating as slave merchants. While some judges, Wesley protested, are often the slave's greatest tyrants, are any laws so binding as the eternal laws of justice, he asks? While as for liberty, he proclaims it the right of every human creature as soon as he breathes the vital air. Countering the excuse that English slavery was more humane than that of other countries, Wesley marshaled evidence completely demolishing this subterfuge and proving conclusively that conditions under English masters are no better than under French or Dutch. The grand idol of the whole traffic, he avowed, was the god of gain, and all its supporters he impeached as petty tyrants over human freedom. The luxurious grandeur of which the slave's misery formed so large a part was under the scourge of heaven, and it was the work of all Christians to proclaim the liberty of heaven and act as instruments of God for the suppression of slavery. Give liberty, cried Wesley, to whom liberty is due, that is, to every child of man, to every partaker of human nature. Let none serve you but by his own act and deed, by his own voluntary choice. Away with all whips, all chains, all compulsion. Be gentle toward all men. In other publications where Wesley deals with the slave traffic, his denunciations are equally piquant. In his serious address to the people of England with regard to the state of the nation, written in 1777, during the tumult of the American Revolutionary War, he answers the lamentations over a marked loss in the slave trade. I would to God, he thunders, that it may never be found more, that we may never more steal and sell our brothers like beasts, never murder them by thousands and tens of thousands. O may this worse than Mohammedan, worse than pagan abomination be removed from us forever. Never was anything such a reproach to England since it was a nation as having any hand in this execrable traffic. A bit later he breaks into characteristic irony. And we can no longer sell our brethren like sheep and pour out their blood like water. Therefore the nation is in a desperate state. Therefore we are on the brink of ruin. Are these the best arguments that can be brought forward to support the lamentable conclusion? 3 times in this address Wesley reverted to the national disgrace of slavery, and concluding he dealt a giant blow. Quote, with respect to trade of the West Indies, you may grant it is greatly decreased. Planters there cannot carry on their trade of buying the bodies and souls of men. God grant, for the honor of our country and religion, that they may never be able to carry it on more. The total, final destruction of this horrid trade would rejoice every lover of mankind. Yes, through our sugar islands, so the inhabitants escaped, were swallowed. Let me read that again. Yea, though our sugar islands, so the inhabitants escaped, were swallowed up in the depths of the sea, certain it is that England may not only subsist, but abundantly prosper without them, may increase in population, agriculture, manufacture, though we no more suck the blood and devour the flesh of the less barbarous Africans. O earth, hide not their blood, and no more cover their shame. End of quote. In Wesley, the Negro slaves found a Daniel come to judgment. Even as early as the writing of his Thoughts upon Slavery, Wesley was revered by more people and influenced more consciences than any other man in England. Yet every one of his followers was taught to regard the Negro slave as a brother in Christ. Nor was it any accident that the great emancipator was a spiritual son of Wesley. Here he's referring to Wilberforce. Or that the great prophet's last letter, written but 6 days before his death, was addressed to Wilberforce. This is what he said in that letter. Unless the divine power has raised you up to be as an Athanasius against the world, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy which is the scandal of religion, of England, and of human nature. Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary in well-doing. Go on, in the name of God, and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it. Reading this morning a tract wrote by a poor African, I was particularly struck by that circumstance that a man who has a black skin, being wronged or outraged by a white man, can have no redress. It being a law in our colonies that the oath of a black against a white goes for nothing. What villainy is this? That he who has guided you from your youth up may continue to strengthen you in this and in all things, is the prayer of, dear sir, your affectionate servant, John Wesley. This, of course, is written in the middle of Wilberforce's initial struggle in British Parliament to put the slave trade where in the center of the conscience of England first, and then, of course, in the debates of Parliament, which would take from this time about 16 or 17 more years to the point where the slave trade was finally abolished. But you can see Wesley is anticipating, as he says here, unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? The tract by a poor African referred to in this letter was Gustavus Vasa, Autobiography of a Black Slave. It was the last secular book Wesley read. On his deathbed, strength failing him, he desired both James Rogers and Elizabeth Ritchie to read to him from this treatise. Even in his last hours, therefore, the burden of those tortured black brethren pressed heavily on this holy man's heart. An immortal emancipator was being taught by a slave. Next segment will be the reproach of war, because this, of course, is all happening in the middle of the French Revolution, and Napoleon is on the horizon. We'll put in a link to Wilberforce, the book he wrote a generation after, in between the abolition of the slave trade and the final abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Wilberforce had written a book called Real Christianity, so I'll put in a link to the first of the series that Vivian did on Wilberforce's book.